Howdy, and welcome to the Petrus Development Show, where we discuss fundraising in the religious sector and how generosity and giving impacts both the organization and the donor. From campus ministries to high schools, from universities and faith-based nonprofits to Catholic parishes, we bring you stories, insights, and best practices that will inspire, educate, and inform you to go out and raise more money for your ministry and the kingdom. God bless, and thank you for joining us today.
Hello, and welcome back to the Petrus Development Show. This is Tara Doyon, Director of Operations at Petrus Development. This past June, leaders and fundraising staff from all types of Catholic nonprofits gathered in Louisville, Kentucky for RAISE23, the Catholic Fundraising Conference. Attendees were inspired and learned about topics ranging from academics to boots-on-the-ground fundraising. Today, we want to revisit some of the great insights from RAISE23. But before we get started, you should know that the best deal of the year on registration for next year's conference, RAISE24 in San Antonio, Texas, is happening now. Get 15% off the super early bird registration price when you register for RAISE24 by Friday, December 1st, 2023. Check out petrusdevelopment.com/raise24 for more details. First up is Eva Daniels from the Speak Shop. Eva is a former producer for Focus on the Family and speechwriter for Dave Ramsey. She shared wisdom from her professional experience on how to engage your audience with storytelling. Let's take a listen.
And these are a few of the things that I have learned that I want to share with you. And as I share them, you might think, well, that's not a secret. That's really simple and obvious. But simple and easy are not the same things. Concepts can be simple, but they can actually be very hard to apply. So let's look at the three secrets. The first is that great speakers know their stories. And there are three types of stories that you need to know as a fundraiser. The first is your company's story. What is your origin story and your founder's story? I had the chance to meet with so many of you throughout the day and last night. I know many of you work for universities, and some of those universities have stood as just beacons of light for hundreds of years. And so it's been a lot longer since that foundation. Some of you work for new nonprofits that have started within the last year. But it's important not only that you know the founding story of the company, but that you can concisely tell it within 90 seconds to 2 minutes, and everyone on your team can tell it, all the way down from the top dog CEO, all the way down to the janitor of your company. You need to know the ins and outs of your story. There's a really famous story of JFK as NASA was trying to put a man on the moon, and he was walking through the building of NASA, and he asked a janitor, he said, "What are you doing?" And the janitor says, "I'm putting a man on the moon." That story illustrates how important it is for every single person in your organization to know the founding story. Why did you guys start? What problem do you solve in the world? What were some of those early failure stories like? Did you ever have a moment in your organization that you thought you weren't going to make it? How did you work through that? You need to get in the pattern of telling these stories to your team, whether that's a weekly staff meeting, whether that's done through email or written communication. Every single person on your team should be able to tell your company's founding stories. The next is to know your story within the company. Okay, how many of you work where you do because you make a lot of money? Okay, let's not be shy. Okay, case in point. We work for companies because we believe in the mission of what we're doing. And we hopefully are also making a lot of money. But you want to be able to tell your story of the company you work for. Why do you work where you do? What is the intersection of your life and where you work? I know I've talked with several of you who work for Newman Centers and different churches and groups on campuses with college students. I can bet that you work there because you either were impacted as a student or because you've seen the impact on students' life. So we're going to do a little exercise, and for the next 3 minutes, 90 seconds apiece, I want you to turn to someone next to you and share with them the story of why you work where you do. How many of you, by a show of hands, felt that that exercise was pretty easy for you? You knew what you're going to say, where you were going in your 90 seconds. Okay, that's great. I love that because that shows that you have done the work already to figure out how you can tell your story within the company in a compelling way. It's a lot harder, though, on this next one, and that is to know your customer's story and to tell their story in a compelling way. This is the third story you need to be able to know how to tell. What happens to a lot of us after a decade in the nonprofit world, it would come to the end of the year and December, and I worked on a team where we were sending end-of-year campaigns, and we wanted to include stories, and we went to figure out what the stories were, and we're like, wow, so many amazing things have happened this year. And then we didn't actually have a good system for how we were keeping track of those stories. Can anyone else relate to that? Has that ever happened to you when it comes time? Okay, thank you for making me not feel alone because this has happened at numerous places I have worked over the years. It is very important for you that you have a system to track your customer or your client's story. For those of you who are in college ministry of some kind, how are you going to track the transformation that you see in students from freshman year to senior year? As a great story comes in on social media, whose job is it on the team to chase that story down? Because a lot of times what we get as organizations is we get a lot of half stories. Someone says a great comment, but it's not necessarily a story. So who on your team is going to track that person down and say, I love that comment that you shared with us on LinkedIn or Facebook or Instagram or TikTok. Could I set up a time to talk with you for 10 to 15 minutes over the phone? And while that story and that experience is fresh on your client's life, grabbing that story. And who is on your team is going to be responsible as you have, the teen mom that comes into your pregnancy help center. Who's going to be grabbing those stories? You need a chief storytelling officer on your team. And this is not necessarily a title or a position. You can give this title to anyone on your team. Who would have time? Who can wear another hat? Let's be honest. We all work in the nonprofit world. We're all doing 4 jobs anyway. So who else could take on this curator of stories on your team? Because you need to be gathering these stories now, because they are the stories that change and motivate and inspire your donors to give. You need to think holistically about your company because stories are coming in from all avenues, and share your stories.
Next, we will hear from Deacon Charlie Echeverry, an ordained deacon from Los Angeles and managing director of Black Brown Collective. Deacon Charlie also brought a wealth of business experience, having previously worked at AOL, Disney, and Univision. Deacon Charlie discussed the quickly changing demographics of Hispanics in the American church and how we can better engage this vital population.
I've often thought about, well, how come we weren't born at a different time and place? We could have been, 9th century Africans, or we could have been 1st century Asians. But we are all, by and large, whether you were born here or not, we're Americans living in the 21st century. And that means it's really important for us to understand what Pope Francis talks about, which is smelling like the sheep. Well, who are our sheep? They're not the same sheep in the 9th century in Africa. They're not the same sheep from Asia in the 1st century. They're the sheep of America in the 21st century. And do we really know who our sheep are? And here, sheep I'm using to include not just the people that you serve with your apostolates, with your ministries, but also the people who donate to those ministries and apostolates. They're part of that story. Who are these sheep? So to answer that question, I think we got to look at it in 2 different ways. The first way is to look at it from a country perspective. The second way is to look at it from a church perspective. So let's look at it from the country standpoint first. There's a lot here, okay? Number one, if we were to look at the U.S. demographics, we'd find very quickly that the fastest growing population in America by a moonshot is the Latino community. It is 62 million people living in the U.S. right now, and that's the ones that we know of. If we include undocumented brothers and sisters, my guess is that figure is probably closer to 80 million. But even at 62 million, that is the second largest Hispanic country in the world, Only Mexico's larger. Mexico has about 120 million people living in it. Number 2, the Latino population in the United States. Then after that, Colombia and Argentina and every other, Spanish-speaking country. It's roughly 19% of the population right now, 2 out of 10 people. And it's driving all of our population growth. If you isolate just growth, you find that the Latino population is driving literally all of the country's growth when you compare Latino to non-Latino. And so you see that reflected in these graphs. In states like my own home state, California, 1 out of every 2 births is to a Latina mom. In New York, the same thing. Across the country, it's 1 out of 4. 1 out of 4 births. And then when you roll all of this up, in secular terms as economic power, it is a massive marketplace. It's nearly $2 trillion this year that country within a country, nation within a nation, will actually go out into the world and spend, okay? Couple of notes on language preference, and we'll talk a little bit more about this because we get hung up on this quite a bit, especially in the church. From a language preference standpoint, it's important for us to consider where somebody is born, where somebody's from, in order to better isolate, what language we should use to reach them in. But by and large, what you see is that if they're born here, the preference is to English. If they're born somewhere else, the preference is to Spanish. But here's the real insight. Every Latino in the country, including me, anybody you run into, is going to be, broadly speaking, bilingual on some level. They're all going to be bilingual just on a scale. What's important, or in my opinion, more important, irrespective of language, is culture. And we're going to talk about that a little bit more in the presentation. If you were to isolate just the bicultural, bilingual, people like me, if you were to isolate just us, and the study that my firm has done has found that among the Latino population, this group, the bilingual, bicultural group, is the most important for missionary and activism type of opportunities. They're the most important. They serve as a kind of bridge between worlds, and they're the ones who want to get most involved. If you just isolate that group, you're talking about 22 million people that has about $700 billion in economic power in the country over the course of a given year. So this is what the sheep look like in the U.S. demographically. Now, let's look at it from a church standpoint. I spent my career, by and large, talking to companies like Nike and Toyota and Target, all these guys, about why they should care about this. And showing them 19% made people's hair light up on fire. They're like, oh my gosh, it's amazing. We've got to develop whole initiatives and hire dozens of people and deploy millions of dollars for this 19%. Well, in the church, it's double that. It's double that. So as urgent as it is from a secular standpoint, it's at least twice as important from a Catholic Church standpoint. There's a few very interesting things when you look at the Latino population from a Catholic perspective. One is that you've got this crazy dynamic that exists simultaneously, and that is that every day more Catholics are Latino, and every day less Latinos are Catholic. How does that work? Because you've got the population growing at the same time that you have defections from the church increasing. So you end up, if you grab 100 Latinos, every day there's going to be one less Catholic. But if you grab 100 Catholics, every day there's going to be one more Latino at the same time. Now, you don't have to be a master statistician or actuarian to map out to the future. And what does this mean? What this means is in the United States, our church every day is getting a little smaller and a little bit more Hispanic every day. Okay, so if we fast forward these current trends, we end up with a small, all-Hispanic church. Who wants that? Nobody, not even the Latinos. And that's not Catholic. Again, universal faith. We should have all cultures represented. But that's the reality of what the statistics actually show. Right now in the United States, 42% of all Catholics are Hispanic. 6 out of 10 Catholics under 18 are Hispanic. 6 out of 10. The stat's actually 61%, roughly, of all Catholics under 18 are Latino. If I walked into Nike or any of these other secular companies and I said, did you know that 60% of your target market is X? And if they didn't know that, if they weren't doing something about that, they'd be fired. People would be fired. People would lose their job. Okay? It doesn't get to this point and then they go, oh, we should do something about it. They've been doing something about it for 2 decades, okay, in the secular world. We're just kind of now getting around to the idea of maybe we should do more than translate the bulletin. We're just getting around to that, okay? But that's the reality. And that moment of inflection on this graph that you see, that little dotted line is where we are today. The moment of total inflection is about 4 years out. 4 years out, when the absolute majority of all Catholics in the U.S. are Latino. 4 years. Okay, so if not now, when? So, from my vantage point, I see Latinos as the biggest unrealized opportunity in the church. That is the sleeping giant.
And finally, we will hear from Bryan Wilburn and Joe Hendrickx from the St. Paul Newman Center at North Dakota State University. Bryan and Joe shared stories from their donor experiences to better equip attendees to get out of the office and meet donors face to face.
Yeah, I mean, there's a statistic, you may have seen it, 85% of people give because they are asked. Now, there's multiple ways to ask, right? You can ask in an email, you can ask in a phone call, you can ask in a multitude of ways. But if we know that the most successful way to ask is face-to-face, heart-to-heart, seeing someone, then why don't we do that? Because, as we know statistically, most people give because they're asked, so we should ask the best way we can. One story that I think of with that, there was a donor for us now who has become, he's given over $5 million to the project. And that started with a phone call. Someone gave me a referral. Maybe you've had one of those, and they say, you should call my brother-in-law, Bob. He's a guy, and he's got, he's done well. And this same guy had given me some pretty bad leads before. I'm like, Larry, not again. I didn't say that, but I was thinking it a little bit. But I do my job. So I called this person, and when I called him, it became very apparent. It's hard to know how in the world he had, at that moment, accumulated such amount wealth, but I could tell he was telling me all of these gifts he had made, the places he cared about, and I explained a little bit about our cause, and he went to school there once upon a time, and he said, wow, yeah, no, I'd support this. I wish you'd have called me 2 weeks ago. I waited 2 weeks because Larry told me to wait 2 weeks to call him because it was right after the end of the year, and he's like, I'd have probably given you, I don't even know, $50,000 probably. And I thought, wow. Well, I said, I'd like to come see you. And he said, nah, you don't need to do that. You don't need it. And, I could have said, yeah, you're right. We'll mail something to you. See you later. But instead, I said, no, I mean, I get it. You know what this ministry is about. I'm going to be there anyway. I'd love a chance to meet with you, and I'd love to see you. And he said, okay. Long story short, met the first time, hit it off. He pledged. I asked in about 10 minutes for a gift. Don't recommend doing that all the time, but this is how it went. And he ended up eventually becoming a $250,000 donor, and then a $500,000, then a $750,000, then $1 million, then $4 million, then over $5 million. So that started because I made a call and I went against the initial push of, oh, you don't need to see me. No, if you're going to go and ask someone, you should probably go ask someone, is the gist of that. The other piece is I want to advocate that we do our job well, that we do the mechanics well, that we ask people. But I want to say that calling donors, I think sometimes we don't want to do it because it feels salesy. We're like, people give. We're annual funds kind of hanging in there. Can we just, do what we do? Why do we need to do this? It actually is less transactional when you call people and when you go see people. Think about that. Well, think about it in terms of taking someone to prom. If you write them a letter, they're probably not going to go. If you call them on the phone, congratulations, people text nowadays, but they're going to do that. But then if you see them in person and they meet you, depends if they like you or not. They still might not go. Not that happened to me. But, no, it's going to be less transactional because if all you do is get a check in the mail from someone and you never call them, or even if you just call to thank them, if you never see them, that's not as relational. But if you get a chance to go meet them and know who they are, that changes things. And to do that well, and I don't want to get ahead of myself, but do that well.
Yeah, so I think he's hitting the nail on the head here. Yeah, not just to sound like the mercenary here. Obviously, calling someone, getting a visit with them, that's going to raise the most funds. But that's also going to get at what we're trying to go here, to be a relationship. It's not like your donors are just an ATM machine, right? So there was, I think about Trudy, one of our couples, one of our donors, who's just phenomenal. But the first time we made an ask, it was for $100,000, and they kind of laughed and stuff, and they gave $10,000. Okay, so then some time passes, and we keep talking with them. And then we're like, hey, we have this stained glass window going on in the new chapel. It's $90,000. Can you do that? And they're like, no, that's way too high. Over the course of the time, and we got to know her, we got to be really good friends. Her previous parish, she helped start this prayer group, and it was called the Upper Room. And she talked about like how formative this was, and this made such a big impact and stuff like that. And later, it was a light bulb moment. We're like, hey, we have this student lounge that's on the second floor that overlooks the campus. What if we asked her to sponsor that, and we call it the Upper Room? And that time we came back again and said, $100,000, it's called the Upper Room. And she's like, the Upper Room.
No, she said, she's like, oh, honey, Glenn, what do you want to do? Whatever you want. I mean, and he said, well, we could probably do that. And I said, Glenn, I'm going to marry you. No. That's not being recorded, right? So, unfortunately. But no, it was just an example. Yeah. Yeah,
this great developing of the relationship. And of course, that did raise more money for our ministry, but it also won us this incredible friendship. And they got to experience that joy of giving too, right? They were happy to give sacrificially like that.
If you enjoyed hearing a little bit from our great speakers at RAISE23, I hope you will consider joining us for RAISE24 in beautiful San Antonio, Texas, June 24th through the 26th, 2024. We will be gathering for 3 days of learning, inspiration, and fun right on the beautiful San Antonio Riverwalk. And like I mentioned at the top of the show, the best deal of the year on registration for RAISE24 is happening now. Get 15% off the super early bird registration price when you register for RAISE by Friday, December 1st. Check out petrusdevelopment.com/RAISE24. That's petrusdevelopment.com/RAISE24 for more details. Hope to see you there, and God bless.
I'm so glad that you could join us for this episode of the Petrus Development Show. Do you know anybody whose ministry needs to take their fundraising to the next level? Please pass along this show to them. And if you haven't already, take a minute and do 3 things. Subscribe to the podcast so you never miss an episode. If you like the show, give us a 5-star rating and leave us a review. And check out our website, petrusdevelopment.com. Your ministry and the kingdom need good people doing great development work, and your donors receive just as much benefit from giving as your organization does from receiving. And as it says in Luke 5, cast your nets out into the deep. Be bold and the Lord will provide. God bless, and we'll see you next time.